Hey everyone, welcome back to iPolitics signature podcast, No Talking Points. I am one of your co-hosts, Marco Vigliotti, the editor-in-chief here at iPolitics. I'm joined as always by my other co-host, Brian Storseth, our publisher. We have a great show with you today, for you today with four excellent guests. Nathoo is the Vice President of Strategy and Risk with Enterprise Canada. Jeff Rutledge is a conservative strategist and Vice President with Vantage. Liam Olsen is a North Vancouver Council Candidate with elections being held there this fall. And Parker Lund joins us from Sussex Strategy. Thanks to all of you for joining us. We have a lot to kind of go through, a busy kind of dash to the finish here in Ottawa, and obviously various different political storylines across the country. But we're going to start here on the Hill. We had I won't call it an about face or a walk back, but the government was seemingly poised to move ahead with some big regulatory changes, setting up the end of consultations on this, I believe, last week. And we're all expecting this package of legislative reforms to come in the form of a bill shortly after. But that doesn't seem to be the case anymore. Consultations will now run through the summer, which means we will probably deal with that back in the fall. They said they blamed it on just the, desire for more consultations, just the amount of activity. But, I'll start with you, Jeff. What do you think was the actual motivating factor by why the government seemed to pump the brakes on some pretty consequential reforms here?
It's a great question. And I think there are a lot of people that are holding their breath right now to see whether or not the government will make good on their commitment to actually making it possible to build things in this country. And I think, sure, certainly consultation is important. I think a lot of the pieces that they were hearing back is probably stuff that industry and others have been saying for many, many years. I think kind of the stinking albatross that is hanging around their neck is that they were trying to rush consultations with, certainly First Nations and Indigenous communities in this country that necessarily didn't reflect where they wanted to head. And I think the other piece on this is there are clearly some court cases and some, issues that are sticking their heads up in BC that are going to likely have impacts on how conversations around consultation with First Nations and Indigenous communities in this country take place. And so I think certainly that probably plays into the delays that are happening. It's kind of an easy out to say, hey, there's just so much feedback. We've gotten so much that it's going to take us longer to make it through all of it and make sure that legislation and the regulatory changes reflect that. But I do think it is an issue that there are some outstanding court decisions that need to be made that could directly impact how those consultations take place.
That's a great point, Jeff. I'll lead with Liam because, you mentioned BC, but is that a fair read? I mean, Jeff brings up, the convenience excuse. You could have argued that I'm sure C5 would have had a lot of people who wanted to argue or consult on that, and that kind of went through at a rapid pace through Parliament. So is this just an excuse, Liam?
Well, I can't speak to any of the backroom stuff that's happened here, but what I can say from a BC perspective is that BC is known for having a lot of environmentalists, and I might put myself in that box occasionally, but I would say even for us, I think of a local school in Coquitlam. This is when I was still a ministerial staffer that they'd done all the hard work. They had secured the funding, $135 million from the BC government. And there was one permit standing in the way of construction, and that was a pileated woodpecker nest. And if you're not familiar with pileated woodpeckers, it is not an endangered species in Canada. But that nest, because of how the regulations were written at the time, was blocking construction. Eventually they started, but I believe it was about 2 years of delays until it got going. So there's a lot of regulations to sort through, everything from that end where I think very few people would think that those regulations should stay and be blocking access to education for kids. But then on the harder end, it's, we love our nature and you got to keep some of the good stuff too and not throw it out with the bathwater. So I think that's how I would look at it, and a lot of British Columbians would see it too.
That's a fair read, Liam. Freeze, is that really what we're also seeing here in terms of just, some necessary refinements to maybe some overbroad rules or, what were we trying to get at here? And if so, and if it is just, something that is relatively, not terribly controversial, then why did the government seem to take a step back? Were they surprised by the pushback? Like what's happening here?
As a base case, when you publish regulation in government, you sort of hope you're in the right ballpark to start with, right? And so that the fact that they've taken another loop around means that they are taking away some lessons, and probably the volume of the feedback factors into that. I think we can all agree, and Jeff and Liam have said this in very different ways, that the changes they put forward are ambitious, let's say, and they kind of come in the context context of an already pretty crowded legislative and regulatory agenda. Marco, you mentioned C5 as a good example of that. I think what's also helpful to keep in mind is the broader context of the resource development sector in the background here, right? I think private sector and government have been using the time to have a sort of useful dialogue about a number of major projects. I think that speaks to some renewed optimism and investor confidence. So all to say, do the regs need fine tuning? Probably. Is an extended consultation process for the government a useful thing to work through in that time? Also, yeah.
Do you agree with Fareed on that?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there's a lot going on, and at the end of a session, one thing that the government really needs to think about is what is the message that people are bringing back, MPs are bringing back into their communities, that they're going to their farmers market to talk about, and what is the feedback they're going to be hearing from people. It seems like they got some pushback on this. They heard from people and they wanted to extend that, and probably thought it was best just to push it to the fall so that MPs also weren't having to deal with that and listen to all of these concerns throughout the summer.
Brian, you've been in that role before. Do you think that Parker's right on the nose, that this is a way to kind of punt this down so that, MPs aren't just inundated with criticism over this over the summer?
Well, I mean, I think they're kind of caught in a bit of a pincer of their own making here. They want to look, and with the initial announcement, they want everything to look fast. They're moving at speeds we've never seen before. But at the same time, they create an expectation that we would start seeing what the legislation would look like. We'd start seeing what some of the changes were going to look like. All that while they're going to have 4 by-elections coming up, probably in August in British Columbia, Quebec, and Toronto. I don't think these are necessarily the issues they want to be fighting the by-elections on. So it's just easier to shelve this for now. And consultations, always one of the great uses for shelving things.
Yeah, I was going to say, Brian, I'll stick with you. Because on that topic, we saw that report from the Star, I guess over the weekend, that some Liberal MPs were kind of chafing at the PM's tone or aggressiveness when it came to them bringing bad news, or maybe not responding as favorably as he'd like to their kind of messaging. We're heading into the summer break. Polls still really haven't shown much movement. PM still seems to be comfortably ahead. Do you think, maybe this kind of let's hit the brakes on this regulatory package maybe could be read as a message that this government is being a bit more receptive to some of those environmental voices? Or do you think the PM, this is totally unrelated, and the PM is going to continue with the style that got him here so far?
No, look, I think I'm not a whisperer to the PM, and I'm not privy to what goes on behind those doors. But MPs need to suck it up if they're complaining about the Prime Minister not being that nice to them. There's few guys I know that are more intimidating than Prime Minister Harper. But if your constituents are sending you a message, you got to relay it back. That's your job. Look, that story, some of the stuff we're going to start seeing. We're in silly season now. People are tired. It's been a long session. It's hot here in Ottawa. You're trying to cram late night sittings and a lot going on. So you'll get some of these kind of stories come up. But at the end of the day, the Prime Minister has gotten where he is with the way he is, and it seems to be pretty successful so far. So I don't see that changing.
Yeah, Parker, I'll move to you. Like, what do you make of these stories? Because I think the PM certainly has not been shy, in media appearances when he doesn't like a question or something that's being put towards him. He's not shy about making that known. Do you think that this is blown out of proportion, or is it maybe symbolic of the fact that there's some MPs who just aren't on board with his messaging? Like, what do you make of that story?
He's certainly not shy. I think you're right on that. Look, I think this is the type of story that is not unique to Mark Carney. It's something that every party leader grapples with. I think there's a little bit of maybe growing pains that are happening there. The caucus and him are still getting to know each other. We have to remember he's still only about a year and a half into this. And by this, I mean politics in general. So they're still getting used to each other. And, I think it's really important that the Prime Minister and that the Prime Minister's office reflect as to why this story has happened, why MPs have felt that they need to talk to journalists about what's happening in caucus and their feelings behind closed doors. But I don't think it's something that they need to be too concerned about as of right now. I think it's a bit of par for the course, but he's got to be focused on keeping the team together. It's a pretty thin majority and they're going to need every vote. So, it's something they should look at, but not be overly alarmed about right now.
Is that a fair read, Jeff, that it's something you got to pay attention to, but let's not overstate how important or is.
Yeah, I mean, I think for a lot of these folks, they're coming off the tail end of the Trudeau era where they may have been far more relevant, right? And for some of them, this is being an MP in the House of Commons. This is the most powerful that they will ever be at any point in their career. And at the same time, the least powerful, because at the end of the day, the decisions are going to be made by the Prime Minister. And that is a clear signal that has been sent to this caucus. And that is not out of line with the centralization of power in the PMO that has happened over the last 30, 40 years. Like, this is the trajectory, right? And it is very much the style of most recent PMs. And Brian mentions Prime Minister Harper. I mean, that was one of the greatest criticisms that people levied against him. And that was really what started to chip away at the veneer of this like conservative movement was, oh, he's a mean guy. He's mean to Canadians. When the reality was he was just very clear in his expectations of how his caucus would act and how his ministers would act as well. And that, to be honest, created ministerial responsibility, something that largely evaporated under the Trudeau government, right? So I think what you're seeing is a reassertion of the role of the Prime Minister. Mark Carney is not necessarily a traditional politician, and I think he is asserting himself as though he is a CEO of a very large organization. And I don't know too many CEOs, if you were to do a personality profile on them, who are very soft and kind and hold people's hands. This is the reality of the environment we're operating in right now. And to Brian's comment, I think they need to toughen up a bit and start doing their job.
Yeah, not too many huggers in the in the sense. See, I was curious though. One thing, Jeff, I just wanted to, before I let Liam and Freeze weigh in, I was curious because I don't know if this is real life, but I saw on social media the reaction to the story amongst conservatives was almost cheering it on, being like, even if they don't like the PM, they're like, yeah, maybe he should be yelling at these guys. And I just wonder, is this the risk that we run? Like the more that the PM does stuff like this, it puts conservatives in an awkward place where it's like, yeah, you know what? Like there was this concern that, that Trudeau legacy that's still there is holding things back. So this story that, is supposed to be a bad news thing for the PM makes it seem like he's reining in maybe some of the more left-wing elements of that party.
Yeah, I think he is to an extent, but there, you have 14 MPs that go out and are talking behind the scenes to media. I mean, that's not completely unusual, but the reality is, you see Minister Guilbeault leave. I think, he could run the risk here of driving some more of those folks out, or to at least sit as independents. And I think that on the conservative side, of course, as the opposition, you want to see the government doing their job. And so, yeah, I think you can kind of cheer it on when maybe the Prime Minister is, giving the gears to some MPs who, just a short time ago were shouting at you and telling you weren't relevant anymore. So there's a bit of a push-pull there, but I think at the end of the day, the net benefit should be to Canadians, and it should be that these people are doing their jobs and are responsible for delivering on what the Prime Minister has said he's going to do.
And Liam, what do you take of that? Do you think the PM runs the risk of pushing more people at the door with that style, or is it, it's Jeff's point, it's an accountability measure and it's not unique to Mr. Carney?
Well, I would say, in my experiences with Mr. Carney, I mean, he's a man who does his homework. And so if you're going to talk to him, do your homework and come prepared. And that's probably good advice, like you say, like folks have been saying for any good CEO or good leader you're talking to. What I can say from personal experience is I've sat around the national board table of the Liberal Party with two leaders, and this might be similar to Parker's experience with both Justin Trudeau and Mark Carney. And I would say that in those meetings, Mark Carney compares well. He takes copious notes. Like I say, he does his homework. He responded to each of our points substantively. So again, I would just gotta say it as simply as if you do your homework, you'll get more of a hearing. And I'm not a fan of people speaking anonymously through media ever. If you have something to say it. So.
Well, we wouldn't have jobs, Liam, if people didn't.
Fair enough.
We'll edit that. No, joking. Freeze, what's your read in terms of this? Are we blowing it out of proportion? Is it something that's expected? Like, what's your take?
I hope caucus meetings are kind of intense. I mean, it's the governing caucus of the G7 country. We have trade challenges with our closest trading partner. There's a midst of two active wars across the world. And it sort of seems like those conversations ought to be vigorous. And if that means then they're spicy, so be it. Parker's right. They probably got to think about what's a better vent for caucus and like to what extent do they have to seek press attention to sort of like release some of that pressure. But a year into the mandate, newly minted majority situation, Caucus is figuring out how to navigate that dynamic and having hard conversations. It's part of that. I don't think it's particularly helpful or healthy that details of caucus meetings are leaked out. There have been some really memorable conservative caucus leaks over the past few years, and I don't think like those meetings right now are particularly fun conversations either. But you sort of have to ask yourself, like, what's the motivation in leaking out some of that information, and who does it serve? And I think if you look at that holistically, you get a pretty clear picture that this was just a pretty heated.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'll stick with you, Faris, because our next topic wanted to talk about the PM's trip abroad this week and some of those challenges you mentioned that we're seeing on trade, defense, security, and then, of course, some other economic ones around critical minerals and AI. Again, conservatives are going to make this offer. I think calling him Mr. Worldwide is a terrific criticism of him, but we'll wait to see if Mr. Poilievre takes me up on that offer. But Faris, what's kind of the to-do list for the PM when he goes to the G7? I know expectations are high for a trade deal, but probably not going to see much movement there. Like, what's kind of like, let's reset there. Like, what should be the things that PM should look to accomplish when he's in France?
Setting aside, you've baited all five of us into making a Pitbull reference.
Yeah.
Like, I'm looking at two things. Like, one, will there be a leaders level statement on artificial intelligence? What will that consist of? To what extent will it capture huge market sentiment, environmental challenges, and sort of like the role of AI amongst kids and in our communities, particularly vis-a-vis data centers? I'm also going to look pretty closely at interactions between the Prime Minister and Chancellor Scholz. You know, the submarine procurement is kind of drawing to a close, top of headlines. What did those interactions look like? And broadly, I think it's a really useful and vibrant moment for the PM, who's sort of like fundamentally at home on the world stage, fundamentally at home in some of these forums, and having the chance to express himself in those forums is a particularly unique opportunity for him heading into the summer to sort of share some of the essence of his first year and a half as a politician.
Absolutely. Those are some good points. Jeff, what do you make of what the PM needs to accomplish or what you're expecting to see when he goes to France?
You know, it's a challenge because he needs to be substantive, right? And one of the criticisms that he's faced is that he's equivocated on some positions as of late, particularly as it pertains to the U.S. You know, his Canada helping to make America great again comment didn't necessarily land, I think, the way that he had hoped it would land, at least within the Canadian context. And we saw Minister LeBlanc just a few days later, essentially abandon that message in his press conference on the roof of the Canadian embassy in Washington there. But I think in terms of how he's interacting with the other G7 partners, there is always a strategy of who is he going to align with, who is Canada going to align with, and work to kind of lobby to develop some sort of perspective on what is actually going to be delivered coming out of these discussions. And so I think it will be very clear, I think very early on, who those partners will be. Obviously I suspect that France and Great Britain are obviously going to be, or the UK are going to be those partners there, but he has to tread very carefully that he doesn't upset the president, right? Like, we are a very short number of days away from what will likely be a deadline that both Canada, the US, and Mexico blow through in terms of indicating what's going to happen with CUSMA talks or USMCA, however you want to announce it. But he needs to figure out what his message is going to be, who his allies are going to be, and sound substantive coming out of it, because otherwise it'll just be another clippable speech. And I don't know that drives the agenda.
Is that fair, Parker, that, he needs to do something substantive because maybe a few months ago the, speech in Davos was great and got a lot of traction, but at this point Canadians are looking for something a bit different?
Yeah, I think there's some truth to that for sure. I mean, some of the criticism that the Conservatives are trying is just going photo ops, flying around, not delivering much attached to that. I think you could probably dispute some of those points, but, point taken. I think Faris is right, though. This is a place where he feels at home. This is a place that's, good home turf for him, where he's really going to be able to shine and drive that narrative of his year and a half in office, talk about what they've done, and continue to show cooperation with other world leaders, which Canadians are really looking for, and Canadians are proud to see him out on the world stage. The question, of course, is the president and what's going to happen there, because that's just not something you can overly plan for. So they're going to have to be ready to react to whatever comes about that. And I'm sure they will, but that's always a delicate balance that he's going to have to drive. And it's the first time in a while, I think, that they've seen each other publicly, right? So we'll have to see what happens there.
Yeah, the president's always the elephant in the room, right? Liam, when it comes to this trip abroad, obviously so much focus will be, to Parker's point, how, Carney manages the president. Is that like a bit unfair to like put that pressure on him, considering it's a G7 where it's all focused around some bigger global issues as opposed to just our trading relationship?
Man, I'm just a local government guy. I don't know. I think that Freeze put it really well. I mean, he's at home on the world stage. It's what I think Canadians are mainly looking for right now, is someone who could manage that relationship and then also make that relationship, I mean, not less important, but also other relationships as important as well. And I think this trip's a big part of that. Maybe I'd actually lean into my local government experience right now and just say, I think what needs to keep happening, the good job of this in terms of the trip to China, like what is being delivered for communities locally? What are people who are not following and 40,000 feet international politics? What are ordinary Canadians getting out of this? I think the China trip was good because it's like, if you're a canola farmer in Saskatchewan, this trip is good for you. And I think those linkages need to keep happening, folks at the local level. They are happening, but it's a good reminder every once in a while that you need to bring it home for what's happening in communities too.
Starting to sound like Pierre.
Bring it. Sorry, I'll bring it home. Connect the dots.
Can I make a bet on what might get brought up here, though? I'll put a toonie down that the president uses a 51st state reference at the G7. That's my bet.
I think he's going to work that one in a while. Okay, I'll take that action. Brian, to you, Liam brings up a good point, being like, we got to start drawing some connections here in terms of those trips leading to some substantive outcomes for Canadians. Is that a fair read?
I think it's a fair read, but I think as you launch into the summer recess, it's always good for government. It's good for government. They've got announcements. They control the agenda. And with this prime minister, he does do better abroad. He gets foreign coverage, which is always less intense, and you get your message through better. I think the big risk is, while you are traveling, we saw it with the India trip, the dynamics of the U.S. president. I mean, you don't have the same staff and the same capacity to respond appropriately, and that's probably the risk. But I think this trip and these types of trips play to Carney's advantage, and I do think that the bringing it, like Liam's point on trying to show Canadians the value that you're getting out of these trips is important. Even as conservatives, you have to acknowledge, like, I sat with people from the UAE that were there and said they've never seen the head of the UAE take the time that they did with Prime Minister Carney in the room, just the two of them, right? He's clearly good at that kind of thing. I think it's more to be seen how he is at handling the local and domestic economy. And none of that's going to come up over the next month as summer recess starts.
No, you bring up that point, Brian, and that brings us to our next topic. House is set to rise. The schedule says next Friday, likely a bit earlier. There's a lot on the to-do list. Like if you had the PM's ear about strategy, what would you say that he needs to do, not just necessarily in terms of legislation, but kind of the message he needs to bring home as we wrap up the spring sitting?
Who's that to, Marco?
Sorry, it's Brian.
I don't have the PM's ear. If I had the PM's ear, I wouldn't be on this talking. No, look, I think it is. I think the travel is good for them. I think the problems that they're going to run into, you're starting to see with the caucus descent. I think the Billy Bishop Airport's going to be another one of those issues where you've got the Liberal caucus vehemently opposed to something that the Ford government is pushing, and they're caught in consultation mode rather than actually taking any kind of definitive political action. And I think that's going to be something that gets them stuck. There's still a lot of tendency to talk about big things, but we still haven't seen it yet. And I think that's the biggest risk they have.
Yeah, Fareed, what do you think about that?
I think one of the key things about a summer recess is making sure you don't go into it with any questions unanswered. So beginning with the legislative front, any of the legislation that's going to come in this kind of like final mile before the House rises, they have to be prepared and have a very compelling narrative about that legislation going into the summer. From my perspective, the bills that I'll be watching is sort of the spring economic update legislation and the budget legislation. Like those are the gimmies. You got to have a good sense of where those track before the House rises. And that gives you a sense of how effectively your team is managing House time, and also how much House time you've had available to you since you've entered into a full majority situations. My bonus watch out will be to see how committees drop to a close and how much the usual end of committees over the summer is decried as shutting down Parliament. I'll weep for the Conservatives who've got to make that play over the next couple of weeks, and I'll be thinking of them during this time.
Parker, what do you make of that? I mean, Freeze had a pretty exhaustive list about the things to watch out for. Is there anything else you would add?
Yeah, no, I think he's right in terms of tying up all loose ends. And then, as Brian kind of said, how are we communicating those out in the communities, giving those messages to MPs to go talk about these types of things that are at the door? This government has delivered a lot of big programs that are, around defense, around the economy. How do you break that down and get people what they need to go talk about that in their communities where they can feel that impact? I think is a really important thing right now. I'm interested in the social media ban that's coming out today. And how that's going to work. I think that's an interesting thing to put in the window right as the session is kind of coming to a close as well.
That's a good point. What a way to kind of end the sitting. I'll go to Jeff and then Liam. What would your guidance be?
Yeah, well, I mean, they got to get the spending stuff done, right? Like that's just fundamentally the government. If you want to say that you're actually able to get stuff done and you got a majority, like that has to be, because that was essentially the mandate that they said that they got. So they need to be able to close out on that. Everybody will be shocked that, Bill C-22, which has been framed as the online surveillance bill, that is largely probably going to fall to the wayside for a minute and potentially kick to the fall. You've got the cyber protection bill, C8, that's kicking around that'll probably get passed. C9, which is the hate bill, which I think is actually a really important one for a lot of MPs to be able to go back to the community and say, we've seen the minister out on this saying that this is how they deal with anti-Semitism, which the Prime Minister was speaking to here in Toronto, I guess just about a week ago, and received quite significant criticism over his framing, by the way. But and then C14 in the bail reform bill, which is also really significant. Again, crime, which is not just an urban issue at the moment for a lot of Canadians, but a rural issue in terms of what has been bubbling up. So what I will say is I think that this is actually going to be a far more challenging summer communications wise for all governments in this country, because of where things are going to be at with the states. And as much as Canadians like to turn the volume down on everything politics over the summer, and I think, there still will be a good portion of Canadians that do, I think that the president cuts through that. And I think that the trade talks cut through that because of the local economic impacts and because of the affordability issue. And so, as people's bills continue to go up, as the cost of living issues remain, I think that a lot of MPs are going to get an earful when they get back to say, hey, we're trusting you, but when are we going to see results?
Yeah, that's a great point, Jeff. Liam, do you think that's a fair read of, or a fair framing of what parliamentarians can expect this summer?
I mean, we'll just have to see. I mean, I think Jeff got to C9 as a British Columbian ad C10, and that's the bill for the Modern Treaty Commissioner. A lot of discussion about that in my home province around here. And I think that's really important legislation that my former colleagues are doing right now, because modern treaties are one of the really good tools to make sure that, if you're a Canadian, you don't have to choose between supporting reconciliation and worrying about your house, right? And so modern treaties are a fantastic tool to do that. And it's something that even the BC Conservatives here, who have made it kind of the centerpiece of their leadership election that ended just recently, they voted for modern treaties when they've come through the House just this spring. So I think that's a really important piece of legislation, both in the policy front, but also to communicate out to British Columbians that, that there's a way forward here.
Yeah, no, a lot to kind of look forward to. And we've been on top of the C9 stuff, which I think will pass probably within the next coming days, as the government has accepted the only Senate amendment. I guess the next thing we should talk about is something that I feel like we got a lot of heat for last week, and it might get overwhelmed by the announcement today around social media bans, but it was the AI strategy. The government was talking about this for quite some time, finally landed last week. I'll start with you, Jeff. What do you make of it? Was it just, hype? Was there anything substantial there? What's your read of how the government did in terms of that document?
Yeah, well, I think it was a necessary thing to do, right? Because Canada, for a number of years, was genuinely leading on all things AI. That was a reality. We had the smartest people, we had the best, we had the best institutions here. But what became a reality for the AI space in Canada was that all of these fantastic people were looking around the world for the places that actually had the computing capacity and the actual hard physical assets that are required to do the next great things with AI. And so, we needed to signal to the world that, yeah, we take this seriously. Yes, we're going to make investments in it. Yes, we are going to do the right things to create kind of the safety around it. And obviously we have this horrific shooting that happens in BC, which is really a starting point for the discussion around how do we ensure that not the starting point, but a point for the conversation around how do we ensure safety in how we use these tools. But it was so funny. I remembered, as in preparation for this discussion today, having to read this document back in high school in my information technology class. And it was the original strategy around how Canada was going to adopt the internet that had been developed by the federal government. It was published in 1994. And the study itself is called Canada's Information Highway: Services, Accessibility, and Affordability. And I kid you not, if you go and take a wander through this document, you could cut and paste 90% of it into the AI strategy and say it's the same thing. It's equitability, it's safety, it's ensuring that the government has the right regulations around this sort of thing. And that's the reality. We are dealing with a bit of an unknown here that is being driven by non-state actors, and we are trying to match the pace of it. It's a serious challenge, but I do think that it's an important signal to the global AI space that Canada is taking it seriously. The problem is, do we have enough capital here to finance the hardware and the infrastructure that's required for Canada to remain a leader?
Fareed, what do you think of what Jeff just said? Is this more of a question of whether or not we got the money to actually do what we need to become an attractive destination for AI?
I've been spending a lot of time kind of where Jeff ended there on the investment side of things, and just sort of thinking through that side of things. I mean, we're entering a summer full of US super IPOs, with 2 in the AI space in OpenAI and Anthropic. For an investment focused government, thinking through how Canada is going to get in on the action and breed its own kind of key large anchor companies that go on to scale globally, maybe IPO in Canada, is going to be top of mind. From my perspective, the strongest parts of the strategy were focused on some of the broader framework policy, but also focused on job training, particularly around student work placements and creating a funnel of AI-enabled talent. The tech and investment are moving so fast that the government is going to need to be live and be open to revisiting the strategy and thinking through, does this make sense in 2027? Does this make sense in 2028? Are we keeping up? And so I think that's important. I'll be watching out over the summer to see where data center investments in Canada in particular land. I think there's a couple hot button issues, a couple cities that have put their hands up and said, yes, we'd love to host this, and a couple who said they won't. And how those play out and how we can welcome data centers to Canada in a uniquely Canadian way that protects local communities, that's mindful of noise and pollution and energy usage is going to be what I think is a key issue on this related over the summer.
That's a great point. Something that I think is probably along with, how to deal with, potential job losses that seem all but likely. How do we deal with those thorny issues? I'll go with you, Parker. Was this strategy enough to kind of address those concerns, or to Fareed's point, is this something that's going to require constant revisions in the years ahead?
It's going to require constant revisions and constant attention to it. I think what I've been thinking through a lot is the public sentiment on AI broadly and what people are thinking about it. And I think there's a real risk here to the government, to be honest. People are not a fan of AI. They have a lot of anxieties around it, I think broadly because what they know about it is they think it's going to take their jobs. They think it's going to make their energy costs go up. It's going to have great environmental impacts. They're worried about their kids' safety. I think people are really worried about it, and the government's going to have to do a lot of work to continue to, calm the waters if they're going to be continuing to invest in it and make sure that it's growing here in Canada, which they need to do economically. So it's something that they're going to have to keep an eye on and keep watching. And it's going to be a constant theme, I think, going forward in the political landscape.
Yeah, Liam, what do you think about what Parker just said? Because I think it's a great point that it hasn't been a great PR year for AI, how to sell a strategy around how we need to increasingly adopt it for all the points that, Fareed and Jeff mentioned, while at the same time knowing that there's a lot of deep-seated anxiety about AI adoption.
Well, I think Parker and Fareed said it. I mean, there's a lot of divergent opinions on where AI will go, if you can put it that way. But what I want to know is, I was really encouraged by the fact that they put in the figure 90,000 jobs for young Canadians. I think that's crucial. And so as it moves along, as we figure out where data centers are going to go, I want to know how those 90,000 jobs, where they materialize, how they get created. Youth unemployment has come down, but it's still much higher than it is for the Canadian average, and it's higher among young men actually than young women. So I think it's a crucial piece of not just economic strategy, but job strategy. Again, I think part of the exercise is making those linkages so that whatever your opinion on AI is and what the government's role in regulating it is, I want to know how it's actually creating jobs and creating jobs for those who need it, not eliminating.
That's a good point. And Brian, I'll let you be the closer on this topic, because our major projects reporter, I did a story all talking about the thing that, Liam brought up. What about the job losses? This is something that didn't appear in the report, the government said didn't really have numbers or expectations around what that could mean. Is that the missing piece here, considering the anxiety we're seeing? Like, should we have a sense of how many people are going to lose our jobs? Or, was it unfair to kind of make that calculation? To Jeff's point, we put out a document in the early 90s about internet. I'm sure people who were publishing newspapers were freaking out. They should be freaking out about the job losses they were going to deal with. But it also creates opportunities, right?
Well, yeah. So listen, I think there's some great points made throughout here. I think the interesting part with AI, and I've talked with people of all ages on this, especially researching this topic. And it's interesting. It's like one of those few, when you take it into context of politics, it's one of those few issues where like young people are not positive towards AI because they see their futures are tougher because of it. They're the ones losing the jobs. Older people don't trust AI. It's that newfangled technology thing. So like there's a lot of apprehension about it, but there's no doubt that Canada has to embrace this and be at the forefront of it. I agree with Jeff. We needed to put something in the window that shows that we are serious about it. I think the only point that I would add, and I didn't see reflected, but it's not to say it wasn't done, is there's got to be, when you're talking about the federal government putting forward big announcements like this, there has to be a ton of overlay and consultation with provinces, because nothing's going to get actually done in this country without working with the provinces. It's going to have big impacts on electrical grids, the stability of their grids. There has to be that overlay as well, but this is going to be an interesting next couple of years when it comes to this front and how the government handles and communicates its involvement and why and where they're spending money on this.
That's a good point.
I think that's such an important point. Like where you ended there, Brian. Like, all these tech execs and chancellors of universities in the US getting booed on in their convocation addresses when they raise AI. Like, to what extent does the government expose itself to that? The more it takes an assertive role in regulating AI and in investing in AI and creating the conditions for that investment. It's like it's a real challenge, and you can find yourself on the wrong end of it pretty quickly.
You brought up the provinces. I know in BC, and maybe I'm misinterpreting what's being passed or what was passed in BC, but a lot of that required those big AI data centers to basically secure the power that they need to run them. It seems like maybe that could create some backlash too. Like, we talked about the energy piece there. Is that going to cause our bills to skyrocket to help power a data center where people already are apprehensive about this technology? So,
and Mark, I was going to overlay on the topic we talked about last week with, Saskatchewan bringing on coal-fired electricity again. Like, the environmental play is going to be impacted here as well. Like, there's a lot that goes into something as substantive as this.
Absolutely. We have two topics left, and I want to totally shift gears from BC to Quebec. This is a wild story, and I'm going to once again name drop Aya because she helped kind of walk me through this. But it seems like the new Quebec premier is trying to make the case as she heads to an election this fall that she is the Mark Carney whisperer, and she's able to get a better deal for Quebecers when it comes to infrastructure investments in particular, and that if the PQ win power, they're not going to enjoy that cozy relationship she has with Ottawa. Start with you, Jeff. I don't think I've ever heard of this in recent memory where a Quebec premier is going to run with how close they are to the federal government. Like that, I just like, yeah. Well, what do you make of that?
Yeah, it's kind of wild. I mean, even we saw, and this is kind of on the eastern border, in the premier of Newfoundland come out and talk about how around the Churchill deal, they're going to be negotiating with Quebec and to figure out new terms that are going to be mutually beneficial. And as a part of that, indicated that there was a willingness for the federal government to sit down with the two parties and hammer out that deal together. Like, we're dealing with separation in Alberta, and we're talking about Newfoundland and Quebec sitting down with the feds to negotiate a mutually beneficial deal. It is a very bizarre environment, but I think that there is the component that is driving this is the reality of where Quebec is at this moment, right? And, look, between now and the election is an absolute lifetime in politics, and there's a lot of things that can certainly happen. But I think the reality is most Quebecers are looking at the economic environment that they're operating in right now, the risks to their economy, but also the cultural issues that are going on within Quebec around immigration, et cetera. And they're looking at the parties right now and saying the path to success for Quebec it runs through Ottawa at the moment. And so, we saw Premier Frechette out with Prime Minister Carney, I guess it was just last week, on a significant investment in infrastructure, including, I think, electric buses. At least that was the backdrop for the announcement itself. And it seemed like a very cordial relationship. That is not traditional. I think it's a very smart political move right now. And I think it would be smarter for a lot of other provincial leaders to try to sidle up next to Prime Minister Carney right now, look serious, and perhaps absorb some of his polling numbers.
Yeah, is that what we're seeing, Parker? Like, is Christian Frechette looking at what Doug Ford's doing and be like, that kind of worked for that guy. Maybe I should be besties with the Prime Minister.
Yeah, well, I think one thing is it speaks to the popularity of the Prime Minister, that if Quebec Premier is wanting to work with them and promote him, then I would say that he's probably doing an all right job in the province. The other thing I would just say is that, we've seen a lot of posturing going on this week in the last 2 days, particularly with that race and that election. The Quebec Liberals coming out and saying they're the only Federalist Party, the PQ coming and saying that they drop high-speed rail if they were in government. I think each party is really trying to carve out their lane of success. And the Premier has done a good job of rebounding the CAQ and bringing them back from what was looking at a pretty devastating loss to carve out a lane that puts her in a bit more of a pragmatist, get the job done, get the best results for Quebec. So I think each of them are trying to just carve out their lane right now as they get closer to October. And it's going to be an interesting race to watch.
Yeah, no, it's going to be fascinating. Fareed, what do you make of Parker's point? And also, we talked about how, Christian Frechette is trying to portray herself as a pragmatist in chief. Is that really like maybe the style du jour right now for Canadian politicians, that it's less about being where you land on the political spectrum and more so being like someone who can get things done and can actually find success as we deal with this existential threat from the U.S.?
Yeah, I think the nature of politics right now is one, the cult of celebrity is around politicians is effectively measured in competence rather than clicks. More than ever before. I think people are sort of overwhelmed and probably bored of politics, and as a result, okay with politics being boring and managerial in its nature. We're 6 Anglophones on a call. I think we're 6 Anglophones on a call debating Quebec politics. Dangerous. But, my perspective on the agreement as a whole is a pretty matter-of-fact infrastructure agreement between the PM and the new Premier. Everyone on this call knows that deal isn't landed overnight, probably many, many months in the making. So my takeaway is we're running into a tight provincial election. The government and the team around the PM need to watch pretty carefully how they engage over the summer, particularly in the context of some of the by-elections as we get closer to when the provincial.
Yeah, totally. And Liam, not only will I ask you about this, but and in your neck of the woods, is David Eby being like, where's the love for me, man? Like, everyone's getting a deal. everyone's trying to cozy up to the PM, but he comes here and I'm not feeling any of that love. Is that a fair read?
I don't know if I saw any press releases of David Eby saying, I'll take Quebec's extra fair share, but maybe that's coming.
I'm slightly paraphrasing but
no, I mean, I think, look, I'm also not a Quebec expert, but I'll just add, like, it's worth remembering that for Christine Frechette, this is a CAQ premier. These guys, it's the whole idea of CAQ is its autonomy within Canada, and here instead you have close association. I think it speaks to the fact that the PM is the most popular politician in Quebec, and I haven't seen the poll numbers for BC, but I think it's probably the same for BC. Look, all I will say is I think it's a lesson that for long-time incumbent governments, it's not sufficient to be against something. You have to build a positive vision that you're fighting for, and saying that you're cooperating with most popular politician in the province is a good way to do that. But it's also, I think it speaks to the strength of the economic vision and the vision of Canada and building that the federal government is putting out there. So I think that's a good lesson for, that my provincial government could, yeah, I think it's an interesting positive message, and we'll see how it works out for
Yeah, absolutely. And Brian, I'll give you the final word on this topic.
Listen, I think you guys have done a great job on this one. My record in Quebec politics shows both federally and at leaderships. If I say it, it's almost not right. So I'll take your word on it.
Ryan,
High levels of self-awareness.
Yeah. I'll give you you can start us off with the final topic then. So we end every show by asking, all our guests to talk about something that they're looking forward to in the week ahead, or something that they want to flag for the week that just passed. So I'll give you the floor, Brian.
I kind of brought it up. I'm really, as we get closer to the end of session here, I'm really interested to see how the 4 by-elections are going to overlay with the government's messaging moving in through the summer. We've got by-elections in Quebec, BC, and Toronto at time when the government of Canada is going to be having to make some pretty major decisions around pipelines, around AI, around Alberta's place in Confederation. So I think that's something I'm going to be keeping a real eye on. And I think it's something that's going to dominate at least the government messaging for the next 3 or 4 months.
Absolutely. And Faris, what about you?
As a soccer fan, I can't help but say the World Cup kickoff. Soccer might be the most political sport on the planet in addition to the biggest. And I'm really, really interested in how the local politics of the tournament play out. How do infrastructure investments in Vancouver and Toronto and roads, stadiums, transport, how do those work when some of the biggest teams in the world with the largest fandoms arrive? How do different leaders interact over the course of the tournament? Who shows up to some of these matches?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I'm always so curious seeing this stuff in the States where they're charging a super FIFA fee for using public transit. I don't know if we're doing that here in Canada, but I think it's $60 to take the MBTA to the Patriot Stadium. So wild stuff. How about you, Parker?
Yeah. As we head to the end of session, I'm really looking at what Pierre Poilievre is saying, to be honest with you. I think he's had a little bit of trouble finding his footing over the last little while, a little bit of trouble finding a message that's going to stick. As you mentioned, Brian, there's by-elections that are coming this summer. MPs are heading to the doors. And the last thing that he wants to hear is that they don't have a message, that they don't like their leader when they're talking to their constituents. So I think it's going to be a really big test over this summer for Pierre Poilievre's leadership. And I think it starts now with him really solidifying a message that they can take into the summer and start talking about on the doorsteps.
That's a really good point. All eyes, I think, are on Pierre's future in the months ahead. How about you, Liam?
Yeah, Brian stole mine. So I'm going to actually pivot and add on to Faris's. In terms of the infrastructure piece as local governments, Toronto and Vancouver are welcoming FIFA, there's potential for strike action that certainly among Coast Mountain bus workers here in Vancouver have voted to give their union a strike mandate to negotiate with. Hasn't happened yet. We don't really know where that is and, coming here pretty quickly. So interesting to see how that will shake out in terms of labor relations and how that might then carry the domestic story of FIFA one way or another.
That would be something else, wouldn't that? Well, let's see how that plays out. And Jeff, how about you? What are you looking forward to, or something that you're watching?
Yeah, well, I think we're going to see kind of the final speech from the Prime Minister on what will set the tone over the summer. And I mentioned it earlier on that I think that Donald Trump and the president and the discussions around USMCA are going to cut through a summer break. And so I think that for most politicians, where traditionally it would be a sleepy summer, I do think they're going to face a lot of tough questions. And I think that the affordability crisis, to Parker's comment about Pierre Poilievre trying to find his feet on what that core message is, he called the Prime Minister out today, this morning in a presser, saying I want to debate this affordability crisis, essentially mano a mano in the House of Commons. And I think it's a very smart political move on his front to really drive the conversation in that direction. We saw the overnight interest rate held it again for another quarter or so, or another month, I should say. So there's a lot of challenges that are pressing down on most average Canadians. And I think the polls are going to start to reflect that if the government doesn't respond with real results.
We had to, in the sitting, I think everyone kind of mentioned it in passing, that this is the time for the final arguments. And what is your message going into the summer? Because if it is, the steady as she goes approach may not work. Maybe when trade talks, Canadians are happy that we didn't take a bad deal from the Americans, but I think around the affordability issues, I think people are still very concerned. The Liberals during the cabinet shuffle in January said this was going to be a priority for the sitting. Did they do enough? Was it substantive enough? They're touting that new groceries benefit. Has that reached Canadians? Very curious to see what that means and what if the answers to that, and also if there's anything else coming down the pipeline. But yeah, so that brings us to the end of today's show. I want to thank Jeff, Liam, Parker, and Faris for joining us. It was a terrific discussion. And Brian, thanks always for manning the hosting duties with me, and for all of you for listening. The same time next week. Thank you all, and we'll see you then.